My name is Naomi Carter. I was 37 years old the night my husband slid a sealed envelope across a rooftop table and expected me to disappear politely in front of 180 guests. I remember the exact sound it made. A flat paper crack against white linen. Sharp enough to cut through the jazz trio, the glassware, the easy laughter of people who thought they were attending a success story. My husband smiled when he did it. That was the part I remember most clearly. Not anger, not nerves, a smile. Calm, practiced, public. "Don't do this here," he said softly, as if I were the one bringing humiliation to the table. The terrace lights were strung low over the hotel roof, warm and flattering, making everybody look more important than they were. His investors were there, former colleagues, two city council people, my own parents, even the photographer he'd hired to document what he kept calling the official beginning of the next chapter. That was his phrase, next chapter. He had spent the entire evening saying it like a man unveiling a future he believed belonged only to him. I looked down at the envelope but did not touch it. Then I looked back at him and said, "You practiced this." His jaw shifted once. Small, quick. The kind of movement most people would miss unless they had spent 11 years studying the difference between his public face and his real one. He leaned closer across the table, still smiling for anyone who might glance our way. "You know how to behave," he murmured. "That's one of the things I've always admired about you." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because that was exactly how he thought of me in the end. Not as his wife. Not as the woman who had built the quiet architecture of his life for more than a decade. As a manager of appearances. Someone who knew how to absorb damage without staining the furniture. I picked up my champagne glass and took a small sip. It surprised him that my hand was steady. "If you're listening from somewhere far away, tell me where." I used to think public shame was the strongest weapon a person could use. I know better now. Sometimes it just gives the truth a larger room. My husband's name was Owen Carter. He was 42 that spring, handsome in the polished way some men become when the world has spent too long rewarding confidence without checking the wiring underneath it. He had built a strategy firm over the previous 3 years, or at least that was the story being sold that night. Investors, local press, private clients, all of them had been invited to witness the launch event on the rooftop of the Belmere Hotel downtown. What none of them knew was that I had paid more of the starting costs than any of them had. Not out of recklessness, out of marriage. That is the humiliating thing about betrayal in respectable clothes. From the outside, it looks like support, shared risk, partnership, the elegant struggle story people like to tell later when the business succeeds. Nobody sees the woman moving money quietly from her savings because payroll came short again. Nobody sees her reading vendor agreements at midnight because the man giving keynote speeches forgot the indemnity clause mattered. Nobody sees her calling a landlord, soothing a lender, delaying a contractor, restructuring a household budget so his ambition can keep sounding visionary instead of unstable. They only see the launch party. They only see the man under the lights. And if he chooses his timing well enough, they see the wife become a footnote in real time. That was Owen's plan. I knew it because 8 months earlier I found the messages. Not just the affair, though there was that too. A woman named Marissa Bell, 30 years old, hired as his director of client growth 6 months after the firm opened. Smart, polished, very careful in rooms full of men. I did not hate her, not even then. By the time I found the messages, I understood enough about Owen to know he never seduced people with passion. He seduced them with narrative. He made women feel chosen by the future version of himself. No, the worst thing I found was not the affair. It was a voice note. 53 seconds long, sent from Owen to one of his investors after a dinner I had helped host in our house. In it, he described me as emotionally stable enough to keep this phase quiet and said he intended to handle the divorce after the launch when the optics are strongest. The optics. I listened to that sentence 3 times sitting on the closed toilet lid in our guest bathroom with my phone in both hands and the faucet running so he would not hear me cry. That was 14 months before the rooftop. I did not confront him that night, or the next morning, or even that month. I went quiet. Not passive quiet. Working quiet. There is a difference, and women like me learn it late. By the time he handed me that envelope under the terrace lights, I already knew what was inside. Petition papers drafted to look civil, efficient. Temporary spousal support terms so insulting they were almost elegant in their cruelty. A housing proposal that assumed he would keep the house I had renovated and I would accept a condo buyout he knew I did not want. He had timed it for maximum advantage, public enough to trap me, late enough in the evening that cocktails had softened the room, important enough guests present that I would be forced into grace. That was what he counted on. Grace. He did not know I had spent over a year preparing for the moment he believed he had invented. I set the champagne glass down. Then I reached for the envelope. Not because I intended to open it. Because everyone around us was beginning to notice something was wrong, and I wanted them looking exactly where I wanted them looking. My mother was at the next table over, already turning in her seat. She had always adored Owen in the way mothers sometimes adore the man their daughter marries, when he reflects the kind of status they like to borrow. My father had invested a modest amount in the firm, and talked about Owen's leadership as if it were partly a family asset. Two of Owen's senior clients were standing by the far railing. A local magazine editor was near the bar. Marissa was 10 feet away in a silver dress, pretending to be absorbed in conversation with a couple from Charlotte. I saw her eyes flick toward the envelope and back. I also saw someone else. My husband's older sister, Julia. She was standing near the service station in a navy dress with both hands wrapped around a water glass she was not drinking from. Owen had not invited her. He had not invited his mother either. As far as he knew, both women were at home in Wilmington, where he preferred them to remain when he was performing success for people who valued clean lines and useful family histories. But Julia was there, and she was there because I asked her to come. I slipped one finger under the flap of the envelope, then looked up at Owen and smiled. "Before I open this," I said, clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "there's someone I think should speak first." The smile left his face so quickly it was almost private. "What are you doing?" he asked. I stood. The chair moved back across the stone with a sound that pulled half the terrace toward us. The jazz trio faltered, then stopped. I picked up my clutch and turned, not toward the stage he had rented for his speech, but toward Julia. She did not hesitate. That was one of the things I loved about her by the end. Once she decided to stop protecting him, she did not do it halfway. She crossed the terrace toward me, carrying a thin, brown file folder. There is something about a plain folder in an expensive room that unnerves people immediately. Flowers, candles, crystal, tailored jackets, then one ordinary paper file in a woman's hand. It tells the truth before anyone speaks. Owen came around the table then, still trying to hold his public face together. "Naomi," he said, low and tight, "this is not the time." I turned toward him. "You chose the time," I said. "I'm just correcting the program." That line carried farther than I intended. A few people near the stage went still. My father stood up. My mother said my name in that warning tone women use when they care more about witnesses than daughters. Julia stopped beside me and handed me the folder. Her hand was cold. I did not open it. I already knew what was inside. Copies of transfers, signed notes, screenshots, the repayment schedule Owen had promised his mother and then ignored. Business withdrawals routed through an account none of his investors knew existed, enough to make a room rethink a man very quickly. But even then, that was not the part that mattered most. What mattered was the witness. At the far end of the terrace, just beyond the floral display, Owen had approved himself because he thought white orchids looked expensive without seeming desperate. The elevator doors opened, and his mother stepped out. She was 71, wearing a plum-colored jacket and low heels sensible enough for a woman who no longer trusted slick surfaces. She held her handbag against her body with both hands, and even from across the terrace I could see how hard this was costing her. Owen went pale. Really pale. Not offended. Not embarrassed. Frightened. That was the first moment all night I knew, with complete certainty, that I had already won the only part that mattered. Not the marriage. That had been over for a long time. Not the room. Rooms change their minds constantly. No, what I had won was the truth of him in his own face. "Mom?" he said, and his voice broke right there in front of investors, clients, my parents, the photographer, the woman in the silver dress, and every person he had invited to watch me shrink. His mother looked at him once. Then she looked at me, and I realized the evening he had built so carefully was about to belong to someone else. I should tell you how I got to that rooftop with his mother stepping out of the elevator and a folder in my hand, because none of that happened quickly. People like Owen never collapse in one clean moment. They build a polished version of themselves over years, and if you are married to them, you often end up doing half the construction without realizing the building was never meant to shelter you. When I met him, I was 26 and he was 31. We were both at a fundraising dinner for a regional arts nonprofit, one of those long table events where everyone pretends the chicken is better than it is because the room is full of people who matter to their careers. I was there because my firm had donated legal review hours for the organization's compliance work. He was there because he knew one of the board members and had already learned that being seen in the right rooms could do as much for a man as real achievement, sometimes more. He was easy to like then. That is important to say plainly. I do not trust stories that pretend dangerous people were obvious from the beginning. Most of them are not. Most of them are skilled, attentive, funny in a measured way, curious about exactly the things that make you feel most visible. Owen had that gift. He listened well in the early years. He remembered details. He knew how to make his interest feel specific instead of performative. On our third date, he brought me a first edition of a novel I had mentioned once in passing, and I thought that kind of attention meant depth. What it actually meant, I would learn much later, was that he collected useful information beautifully. I was an attorney then, though not in the dramatic courtroom way people like to imagine. My work was quieter. Corporate structure, partnership disputes, governance cleanup, founder agreements, internal risk. I spent most of my days reading what people had signed, what they thought they had signed, and what they had quietly assumed no one would ever examine closely. It suited me. I liked precision. I liked the discipline of records. I liked that truth on paper could stay still long enough to be understood. Owen liked telling people I was brilliant. That was another thing I misunderstood at first. He liked competent women as long as the competence reflected well on him. As long as it was adjacent, decorative in the right rooms, useful in private. The problem only came later, when my competence began interacting with the parts of his life he preferred to keep soft around the edges. We married 3 years after we met, a small wedding in Asheville in late October, rain in the morning, sun by the vows. My parents loved him. My mother said he had presence, which was always her highest compliment for a man. My father admired his appetite. That was his word, appetite. He meant ambition, but in our family, ambition always sounded more respectable when translated into hunger. Owen came from a smaller, rougher life than mine did, at least on paper. His father had left early. His mother, Lorraine, had raised him and his older sister, Julia, while working billing at a medical practice and taking evening bookkeeping jobs during tax season. She was one of those women who had been exhausted for so long it had settled into her posture. Julia had practically half-raised him in some ways, 6 years older, serious, already adult by the time he reached high school. I liked them both immediately. Lorraine was warm but careful. She thanked people too much. Julia had the kind of silence I trusted. Not frosty, watchful. She was a school counselor outside Wilmington and had a habit of studying rooms the way I did, which made me feel calmer around her. When Owen talked about his family, he always did it with a mix of pride and impatience, as if he loved them but had outgrown the scale of their lives. I thought that was immaturity then, not warning. For the first few years, we were happy in a real way. Not perfect, real. We rented a narrow brick townhouse in Richmond with stairs that creaked and kitchen cabinets that never quite closed flush. We worked too much, ordered takeout too often, argued about ordinary things like travel schedules and whose turn it was to call the plumber. He was at a mid-sized strategy firm then, rising fast because he was exactly the sort of man clients find reassuring at first glance. Crisp, decisive, smooth in presentations. Good at saying, "Let's be practical," in a tone that made people feel childish for resisting him. I made more money than he did for the first 4 years of our marriage. That did not bother me. I am saying that because people always want a cleaner emotional setup than real life gives them. I was not secretly resentful of supporting us. I was proud of what I had built, proud of him too. When he said he wanted to leave the firm and start something of his own, I believed in him completely. He pitched it as freedom at first, more control, better client selection, a leaner model. He had decks, projections, early conversations with possible backers. He sat at our dining table in shirt sleeves with legal pads covered in arrows and said things like, "I know I can build this if I'm not carrying someone else's ceiling." I still remember the exact night I agreed to help. It was February, cold rain against the windows. He had made pasta badly and opened a bottle of wine that was too expensive for a Tuesday. We were sitting at the table after dinner with his draft business plan between us, and he looked at me with that earnestness that had once felt like honesty itself and said, "I can do the front-facing part. I know I can. But I need someone I trust to tell me where the weak points are." That line got me, not because I needed to feel needed, because I believed we were a team. So I did what I always do. I went through the structure, identified risk, revised the operating agreement language, cleaned up early investor terms that were far too generous for what he was offering, suggested a slower burn rate, rebuilt his first-year cash flow assumptions because his original numbers were basically optimism in spreadsheet form. I connected him with a tax partner I trusted and quietly paid the retainer when he hesitated at the cost. I reviewed the lease for his office space, caught a ridiculous personal guarantee clause, negotiated it down, set up vendor protocols, helped him choose insurance, drafted conflict language for client onboarding. No one outside the marriage really knew the extent of it. That was deliberate on his part, though I did not name it that way then. He never told me not to mention my involvement. He just had a way of absorbing my labor into the atmosphere of his success. We're getting it done. Things are coming together. The launch is moving. Passive language, group language, weather language. By the time he was speaking to investors, the structural work I had done had already become part of the room rather than part of me. I let that happen because I loved him and because, at the time, it still felt shared. The money was more visible. I moved funds from a savings account my grandmother had helped me build when I was younger. Then from a bonus I had planned to leave untouched. Then, later, from monthly income, when the firm's first 2 quarters came in lower than projected and he did not want to look unstable in front of investors. It was never all at once. That is how women end up underwriting men's illusions without realizing the full number until much later. 5,000 here, 12 there, a short-term bridge, a payroll patch. A software contract kept alive one more month. He always framed it as timing, not dependence. And I always believed the timing would pass. The first real crack should probably have come sooner than it did. It was not another woman. Not at first. It was the way he spoke about Lorraine once the firm existed. His mother had lent him money early on. I did not know the amount then, only that she had helped a little and he wanted to repay her once things stabilized. That sounded normal to me. Families help each other. My own parents had not needed to help us financially, but I understood what it meant for a mother to want her son's future to work. Then one Sunday afternoon, about a year into the firm, Lorraine called while we were driving back from Charlottesville. Owen had her on speaker, without realizing it because the car audio connected automatically. She asked gently, almost apologetically, whether he had had any chance to think about beginning repayments, even in small amounts. I remember the silence in the car after she said it. And then his face changed. Not rage, worse, contempt, he said, in that cold, controlled voice I would later hear far too often. "Mom, if you're going to think like a cashier instead of an investor, I can't keep explaining this to you." Cashier. I turned my head and looked at him. He did not look back. Lorraine got quiet immediately. She said she was just trying to understand. He told her not to start creating pressure where there did not need to be any, then ended the call and drove the next 10 minutes in irritated silence, as if she had done something to him. I said, finally, "That was cruel." He exhaled through his nose and tapped the steering wheel. "She doesn't understand scale," he said. "Every time I talk to her, she drags things back down to survival level." That sentence stayed with me, not because of the money, because of what it revealed. Anyone who can hear their mother's fear and translate it instantly into annoyance is telling you something about the cost of staying near their ambition. I brought it up again 2 nights later, and he apologized in the way polished men apologize when they want the subject closed more than they want the harm understood. He said he was stressed, that I knew how much pressure he was under, that his mother worried in ways that made him feel small again. I accepted it because by then I was already invested in the marriage, the firm, the future, and the version of him I had spent years building beside. That is another thing nobody likes to admit. By the time betrayal becomes visible, you are often loyal not only to the person, but to the amount of yourself you have already put into believing them. Julia saw more than I did. She visited one weekend in late summer and stayed in our guest room. Owen was performatively charming the whole time, which always told me he was on some level afraid of what she might notice. The second afternoon, while he was out meeting a prospective client, Julia stood in my kitchen peeling peaches for a cobbler she insisted on making and asked, very casually, "How much of the business are you actually carrying?" I remember freezing with a knife in my hand over the cutting board. "Excuse me?" She looked up then, not unkindly. "I'm asking because he talks like a founder and spends like a man with a safety net." I laughed a little because it felt safer than answering directly. She did not laugh. Then she said, "Naomi, I know my brother. He loves being admired more than he loves being honest." I should have taken that more seriously than I did. But at the time, it felt disloyal to let his sister's caution land harder than my own husband's promises. So I defended him the way wives do when they still believe context can rescue character. I said he was under pressure, that he had always been dramatic about money, that startups were messy, that we were fine. Julia nodded, but it was the nod of someone filing away a fact she expects to hurt later. The affair started during the firm's second year, though I did not know it then. Marissa was hired around the same time Owen began speaking more often about image, positioning, strategic partnerships, visibility. Those were his favorite words. When he was drifting far enough from substance to need language as scaffolding, he began traveling more, staying later, coming home full of highly selective detail. Which clients admired him, which investors really understood the long game, which dinners mattered, which people had finally started taking him seriously. He stopped asking about my work. That may sound small, but in a marriage, the loss of curiosity is often the first true abandonment. It happened gradually enough that I could ignore it for longer than I should have. He still kissed my forehead on his way out some mornings, still asked whether I wanted coffee, still knew which restaurants I liked. He did not stop performing affection. He just stopped entering my interior life in any meaningful way. At the same time, he asked more of me. Would I look over a revised subscription agreement? Could I float payroll for 2 weeks until a receivable cleared? Would I mind hosting 6 clients on a Thursday because the optics of a private home dinner mattered? Could I call a contractor because the office build-out timeline was slipping and they always took me more seriously? Every task by itself seemed survivable, reasonable even, but over time the pattern became clear in a way I refused to fully name. My steadiness was financing his image. My competence was compensating for his shortcuts. The marriage had become an ecosystem where he consumed structure and called it partnership. Then came the second phone. It fell from his gym bag onto the laundry room floor on a Tuesday evening in April. I still remember the sound. A light, flat plastic crack against tile. Small enough that someone else might not have noticed it, except I was carrying the bag because, like so many other quiet tasks in our life, unpacking still somehow belonged to me. It was not locked. That detail mattered because it told me he did not expect discovery through domestic channels. He expected invisibility to keep protecting him. The messages were there: Marissa, logistics, hotels, private jokes that made my skin go cold more than graphic language would have. But what ended me, what changed the whole shape of the marriage in my mind, was the voice note. 53 seconds. Owen speaking to an investor I knew by name. Calm, transactional, outlining a post-launch divorce strategy and describing me as stable enough not to make a scene if it's handled publicly. Handled publicly. I sat on the laundry room floor and listened until the room felt unfamiliar. By the time I stood up, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, my marriage had been over long before I found proof of it. Second, he still believed I was the safest person in his life to betray. That was the miscalculation everything else grew from. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. Then I waited. And once I started waiting properly, I began seeing how much had been hidden in plain sight. Once I stopped reacting like a wife and started observing like a lawyer, the marriage changed shape very quickly. Not outwardly. Outwardly, everything still looked respectable. We hosted dinners, we attended openings, we sent the right flowers when the right people got sick or promoted or divorced. Owen still kissed my cheek in kitchens full of guests, still introduced me as the smartest person in any room, which used to sound generous until I realized it was his preferred way of making my real role sound decorative. But privately, I became methodical. I did not confront him after finding the second phone. I did not cry in front of him. I did not ask for explanations he would only use to measure how much I knew. I put the phone back in the gym bag, washed the clothes I had meant to wash, made pasta I did not taste, and sat across from him that night while he talked about a potential hospitality client in Atlanta as if our life were still intact. Then I went upstairs, locked the bathroom door, and made a list. What I knew, what I suspected, what I could prove, and what I would need before he understood I was no longer standing inside the version of me he had built his plan around. The next morning, I called Sheila Wren. She was a family law attorney downtown with the kind of reputation people use the word formidable for when they mean organized enough to frighten men who confuse charm with leverage. I had sent clients to her before: difficult divorces, asset concealment, ownership disputes inside marriages where one spouse thought good tailoring counted as transparency. I told her I needed a private consultation and asked for the last slot of the day. At 6:30 that evening, I sat in her office with the second phone on her desk and the voice note ready to play. She listened once without interrupting. Then she folded her hands and asked me a series of questions in such a clean sequence that I understood immediately why people hired her when they needed to survive rather than simply complain. Did I have access to household financials? Yes. Did I have access to business records? Partial, but more than Owen realized. I had set up the accounting permissions in the first year and had never been fully removed. Did he know I knew? No. Did I intend to stay until I understood the whole picture? Yes. Only then did she nod. Good, she said. Then don't get emotional too early. That line steadied me more than anything else she said that night. Not because I was in danger of hysterics, I was not, but because women are trained to believe the moral center of betrayal lies in confession. Speak up. Ask directly. Demand honesty. Sheila understood what I was only beginning to understand. When the person across from you has already been scripting your humiliation, confession is not clarity. It is information transfer to the wrong side. She connected me with a forensic accountant named Martin Hale, a quiet man in his 50s who wore the same navy cardigan to every meeting and explained financial misconduct with the patience of someone describing weather patterns to children. He did not need drama. He needed documents. So I started gathering them. Slowly. Carefully. I downloaded historical account exports at times Owen was least likely to notice unusual activity. I pulled signed subscription agreements, wire confirmations, operating account statements, reimbursement logs, and the corporate card summaries he assumed I had no reason to review anymore. I forwarded copies to an encrypted archive Martin set up for me. I took photos of handwritten notes Owen left on the kitchen counter, printed a travel calendar he forgot was shared, preserved texts when his tone with me suddenly became more managerial than marital. The pattern emerged over 6 weeks. That timing matters, because nothing truly bad is ever as dramatic on paper as people want it to be. It was not one giant theft with fireworks around it. It was worse than that. It was sustained confidence. Money moved in increments. 5,000, 8,000, 12. Categorized in ways that would sound almost ordinary to anyone moving too quickly. Strategic reserve, temporary transfer, external holding, founder draw adjustment. Every dishonest person loves language that sounds administrative. Then Martin found the account. A Nevada holding company with a name bland enough to disappear in conversation, Bright Harbor Ventures LLC. Not the same as anything from the reference transcript. Different structure, different timeline, same emotional logic. Money from the firm's operating account had been moving into it for months, in amounts small enough to avoid early scrutiny, but regular enough to reveal intent once viewed together. I remember sitting across from Martin in his office while he turned a spreadsheet toward me and said, very calmly, "This is no longer sloppiness. There are moments when your body understands something before your mind catches up." I felt cold first, then angry. Then, strangely, embarrassed on behalf of the version of myself that had still been paying the internet bill, the office software renewals, and our gardener while he was building a private exit account behind my back. But even then, the money was not the worst part. The worst part was the chronology. His planning overlapped almost perfectly with the period when I had been underwriting the firm most heavily. The months he was telling me investor timing was tight and asking me to bridge cash flow were the same months he was moving money elsewhere. The months he said we had to be careful, had to present stability, he had to keep appearances clean for the sake of the launch, were the same months he was sleeping with Marissa and outlining post-launch divorce optics to third parties. He had been taking from every available channel at once. Investors, his mother, me, and still expecting to stand under rooftop lights and be applauded for vision. I drove to Wilmington 2 weeks after my first meeting with Martin. I told Owen I had a compliance retreat in Raleigh and would be gone overnight. He barely looked up from his phone when I said it. That hurt more than it should have. Not because I needed his attention by then, but because indifference is often the final insult before a marriage breaks cleanly. Even deception requires engagement. Disinterest is just disposal in slower clothes. Lorraine lived in a one-story brick house with fading blue shutters and a camellia bush gone unruly by the front walk. She looked smaller than I remembered, though maybe what I really mean is that she looked like someone who had been shrinking herself around one conversation for too long. She opened the door before I knocked twice. I should say this clearly. She was not surprised to see me. Not truly. Only sad. We sat at her kitchen table for nearly 3 hours. Tea went cold between us. At first, she tried to protect him, which is what mothers do, even when the protection is killing them by inches. She said business was complicated, that Owen had always been under pressure, that he meant to fix things once the firm was secure. Then she looked at my face long enough to understand I had not driven there for reassurance. That was when she told me the full amount. Not a small family bridge, not help in the casual sense, a devastating withdrawal from her retirement account. Money she had been too frightened to touch for her own life, handed over because her son promised it would come back within 18 months. It had been nearly 2 years. He had repaid none of it. Known. She had records. Of course she did. Not because she was naturally suspicious, but because people start keeping records when someone they love keeps making them feel unreasonable for remembering correctly. She had notes written after phone calls, dates, phrases, promises, a check copy, one bank transfer confirmation, and, folded into a floral recipe tin under the counter, a letter she had written to herself one night after he made her cry for asking when repayment might begin. I asked if I could read it. She handed it to me without speaking. The letter was not dramatic. That was what made it so hard to read. Just a careful, hurting woman trying to preserve her own reality. She wrote down what she had asked, what he had said, how ashamed she felt afterward, how quickly he could make concern sound like selfishness. Halfway through, I had to stop and put the page flat on the table because my hands were shaking. She should know, Lorraine said then. I looked up. Julia, she said. I should have told her earlier. I asked if I could call her from the kitchen. Lorraine nodded. Julia answered on the second ring and listened in silence while I explained as much as I could without speaking over her mother's dignity. When I finished, she said only, "What do you need from me?" That question changed the rest of the story. Because by then I understood something important. This was not going to be won by exposing Owen privately and letting him negotiate his way back into some softer version of consequence. Men like him survive private correction. They apologize strategically, reframe, offer partial truth, turn your grief into a problem of tone. No. If he wanted a public setting because he believed public pressure would make me compliant, then public truth was the only language he would understand. Still, I did not move too soon. That part matters too. I waited. I let him keep planning. I watched the launch party take shape with the attention of someone studying a legal trap she intends to reverse. He hired a photographer. Approved a guest list. Added my parents, which told me he wanted witnesses from my side too. That was one of the cruelest details. He did not simply want to leave me. He wanted me framed by enough familiar faces that grace would feel compulsory. At one point, standing in our kitchen with his laptop open, he actually asked which dress I might wear to the event because, in his words, we should look like continuity before the next phase starts. I remember looking at him and thinking, there are kinds of evil that never need to shout. I chose silence. Not weak silence. Active silence. I sent everything to Sheila and Martin as it developed. We built a timeline. She prepared my response options in case he served papers before the party. I moved money legally and carefully, documenting every household contribution I had made to the firm, every transfer, every support payment, every guarantee I had covered. We preserved enough to protect me in court, but more than that, enough to destroy the mythology he had built around himself. Then, 3 weeks before the event, I found the investor talking points. He had drafted them in a shared notes folder he forgot still synced to our tablet. There it was in clean bullet points. Vision, momentum, new phase. Difficult personal transition handled privately with dignity. That phrase made me sit down. Handled privately with dignity. Meaning, humiliate me publicly, but described my compliance as grace afterward. I sent screenshots to Sheila within 2 minutes. She called me 5 minutes later and said, "Now you know the stage." I said, "Yes." Then she asked, "Do you want to use it?" I looked around the house I had helped furnish. The hallway mirror I chose, the dining chairs I paid for, the study where Owen sat every night speaking like a founder into a future built partly on his mother's fear and my labor. For a moment, I thought of simply walking away, letting the law handle him, letting the investors discover things through channels that did not involve my face. But then I remembered the voice note, stable enough not to make a scene. I remembered Lorraine at her kitchen table, ashamed for asking about her own retirement. And I remembered something else too. The number of times Owen had counted on women to keep his dignity intact while he dismantled theirs. That was the moment I decided. Not revenge. Correction. I called Julia first. Then Lorraine. I asked neither woman to do anything they did not choose fully. That mattered to me. I explained what I knew, what the launch was for, what he intended, what the documents showed. I told them I would understand if they wanted distance from it. Public exposure costs people, even when they deserve the truth. Julia said yes immediately. Lorraine took longer. At last she said, very quietly, "He needs to hear my voice in a room he can't control." That line stayed with me. After that, the plan became simple. Not easy, simple. Julia would come even though he had not invited her. I would make sure she had access through a +1 under a neutral name. Lorraine would arrive later and privately, after most guests were settled and before the speeches. Rachel, my closest friend, agreed to sit near the rear elevator and text me the moment Lorraine reached the lobby. Martin and Sheila advised me on what documents could be shown publicly without compromising later legal action. We chose only what needed choosing, enough to establish the debt, the diversion, and the lie. Nothing theatrical, nothing sloppy. Then I waited for the night he built for himself. And by the time he slid that envelope across the rooftop table, I was no longer the wife he thought he was handling. I was the only person on that terrace who knew exactly how much his confidence was worth on paper. When Lorraine stepped out of that elevator in her plum jacket and looked straight at her son, I saw the first real fear I had ever seen in him. Not fear of losing me, fear of being known correctly. And once a man like Owen realizes the room is about to meet his real self instead of his public one, everything inside him starts reaching for control at once. That was the moment the launch party stopped belonging to him, and the real beginning of the night finally arrived. Lorraine walked slowly, but not uncertainly. That detail matters to me. She was frightened, yes. Any mother would be. Any woman her age, stepping into a rooftop crowd full of investors, journalists, expensive dresses, and strangers who had come to celebrate her son, would have been frightened, but she was not wavering. She had spent too long being spoken over in private to lose her nerve in public. Owen took one step toward her, then another. "Mom," he said again, and now his voice had lost all the texture he used in rooms like that. It sounded younger suddenly, thin in the wrong places. "What are you doing here?" Lorraine did not answer him. She stopped beside me. Julia moved to her other side without a word. The three of us stood there together while the terrace held its breath around us. I could feel people trying to decide whether this was family awkwardness or something larger. That is how public truth begins most of the time. Not with certainty, with discomfort, with the first collective instinct that the script has slipped. Owen recovered quickly enough that most people might have missed the speed of it. He turned back toward the crowd, raised one hand in a light, almost self-deprecating gesture, and gave a small smile. "Family surprise," he said into the microphone. A few guests laughed politely. He was trying to steer it back into charm. That was always his first move. I stepped forward before the laugh could travel. "No," I said. Not a surprise, a correction. The word carried. The jazz trio had gone completely quiet by then. Even the waitstaff had slowed. I saw the photographer lower his camera halfway, unsure whether he was still documenting a launch or something that might later become evidence in a divorce deposition. Marissa had gone very still near the far bar, one hand wrapped around the stem of a champagne glass she was no longer drinking from. Owen looked at me and I watched the anger flash under his skin. Not loud yet, not visible enough for most people, but there. He had expected tears or retreat or some fragile private plea he could handle with a hand at my elbow and a lowered voice. He had not expected language that made the room reorganize itself against him. I took the brown file from Julia and handed it to Lorraine. I had already marked the pages with tabs. Again, not for spectacle, for clarity. Lorraine held the folder against her chest for a second, like she was feeling the weight of it through the cardboard. Then she opened it and removed the first page with hands that shook once, and then steadied. Owen stepped off the platform. "Give me that," he said, still trying to sound calm. Julia moved half a step in front of their mother. "No," she said. It was the first thing she had spoken all evening, and the simplicity of it did more than any speech would have. People know confidence, but they also know family history when it suddenly hardens in public. Even those who did not know them could hear that Julia was not improvising. She was done. My father came up behind me then, not close enough to touch, but close enough to make his disapproval a physical presence. "Naomi," he said under his breath, "this is not the place." I did not look at him. "That didn't stop him," I said. That line moved through the nearest tables like a current. You could feel people start recalculating what they thought they were watching. Lorraine lifted the first page. Her voice when she began was not loud. It did not need to be. The terrace sound system was still live from Owen's microphone, and he was standing close enough that every word he spoke and every silence he failed to fill kept feeding the room. "In February of last year," she said, looking at the page, "my son asked me for a loan from my retirement account." A sound went through the crowd. Not a gasp exactly, more like the first collective withdrawal of warmth. Owen held up both hands then, smiling with visible effort. "Mom, no, that's not what this is." She kept reading. "He said it was temporary. He said he needed a bridge. He said the firm would repay me within 18 months, and that if I trusted him now, it would secure his future." The room had fully turned by then. I could see it in faces. Investors who had been holding casual smiles 10 seconds earlier were now completely still. One of the councilmen lowered his drink and glanced toward Owen with the expression public men wear when they realize proximity may become a liability. My mother looked like she wanted the floor to open. My father had gone pale around the mouth. Lorraine lowered the paper and pulled out a second one. "This is a copy of the withdrawal," she said. "This is the promised repayment schedule. This is a list of the 11 times I asked about repayment in the 14 months afterward." Owen moved again, this time reaching not for his mother but for the file itself. "Enough," he said, voice tightening. I stepped between them. Not dramatically, just enough. The expression on his face when he realized I was physically blocking him in front of his own guests is one I will probably remember for the rest of my life. Not because it was frightening, because it was so nakedly entitled. He truly believed the room should still bend around him. He lowered his voice. "What do you think you're doing?" And I answered him just as quietly. "Letting your mother finish." Lorraine took out the bank statements next. We had chosen only a few pages, transfers from firm operating funds into the separate holding account Martin had traced. Dates circled, amounts highlighted, not every record, just enough to establish the pattern cleanly. She did not read them all aloud. She did not need to. She simply held them up and said, "These were explained to me as temporary business structures. But when I asked why you could move money here and not repay what you owed me, you told me I was too emotional to understand how real work gets done." The sentence landed with a force that had nothing to do with volume, because everyone there understood it at once. Not just the money, the contempt. That was what made the room go cold. Owen turned toward the guests then, abandoning persuasion with us and trying instead to reclaim the audience. "There are legal explanations for all of this," he said. "Anyone who's ever built a company understands transitional structures." He was talking too fast now. The investors noticed. Of course they did. One of them, Gerald Sloan, a quiet man with the expressionless face of someone who has seen enough founders burn themselves down to know what panic sounds like, spoke from the second table near the rail. "Then perhaps you should have disclosed those structures." No one spoke after that for several seconds. Owen looked at him, then at me, then at the papers in his mother's hands, and I watched the exact instant he understood the evening could no longer be managed through tone. Marissa set her glass down. She had been standing near the bar this whole time, still enough to disappear if someone wasn't looking directly at her. But now she straightened, picked up her clutch, and started walking toward the elevator. Owen saw her. That was almost worse for him than Gerald speaking. "Marissa," he said. Just her name, nothing else, but the way he said it told the room enough. She stopped for 1 second, not turning around. Then she kept walking. I had not planned for that, truly. There are parts of public collapse no one can script. But when she reached the elevator bank and pressed the button without once looking back at him, the remaining uncertainty around the terrace finally dissolved into fact. My mother made a sound under her breath, something between disbelief and humiliation. My father said, harshly, "Naomi, stop this now." Only then did I turn and look at him. I think he expected tears, or shame, or some sign that his authority still mattered more than the truth standing 3 feet away in Lorraine's hands. Instead, I said, very calmly, he handed me divorce papers at his launch party because he thought I'd be too embarrassed in public to defend myself. It was the first time most of those people realized there had been an envelope at all. Heads turned toward the table, toward the untouched legal packet still resting beside my champagne glass. That object did more work than any accusation could have. White envelope, heavy paper, his timing, my untouched handprint nowhere on it. People can argue with anger. They struggle much more with staging. Gerald stood up. Not quickly, quietly. He walked to the table, picked up the envelope, glanced at the first page without fully reading it, and then looked straight at Owen. "You chose tonight?" he asked. That question was fatal. Not because of the words themselves, because of who asked them, and because every person on that terrace could now see the shape of the evening at once. He had not merely been dishonest in business. He had designed a public humiliation into the architecture of his professional celebration. Whatever confidence remained in him as a man of judgment began draining out of the room right there. Owen started talking then in a way I had only heard once before, when he got pulled over years earlier after trying to charm his way past a traffic stop and realizing the officer already had the body cam footage. Faster, smoother on the surface but frantic underneath. He said the divorce was unrelated. He said timing was unfortunate. He said Naomi was emotional and had chosen to collaborate with family members who did not understand business structure. He said private transitions were being weaponized. He said investors were reading too much into temporary reallocations. He said his mother had always worried unnecessarily. He said Julia had personal resentment. He said I had been under stress. Every sentence made him smaller. That is something men like Owen never realize until it is too late. Once the first clean fact is visible, over-explaining stops sounding intelligent and starts sounding guilty. Lorraine closed the folder. Then she looked directly at her son and said the simplest, hardest thing anyone said all night. "You made me feel ashamed for asking you not to use me." I do not think he had prepared for that sentence. Not really. Because there was no business language to hide inside. No investor framing. No founder vocabulary. Just a mother naming what he had done in plain human terms. Julia took the folder gently from Lorraine's hands and put an arm around her shoulders. At that point, the movement began. Not dramatic, not chaotic. That would have almost helped him. No, this was worse. Guests started leaving in socially careful waves. One investor nodded curtly to no one in particular and headed toward the elevators. 2 former colleagues slipped toward the stairs. A journalist I recognized from the business section looked at Owen, then at me, then made the very wise decision not to take out her phone. Even the staff changed. Their politeness toward him had thinned. Public ruin does not always sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like expensive shoes turning away one table at a time. Within minutes, the terrace that was supposed to launch his next phase had become a holding area for people deciding how far they needed to distance themselves and how quickly. Owen stood at the edge of the platform under the Edison lights, his tie slightly off-center now, his hair unsettled at the temple, staring at the room as if it had violated an agreement. He looked at me across what remained of the guests. "You knew," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "How long?" "Long enough to stop helping you." That was the line that finished it. Not because it was cruel. Because it was true. I picked up my clutch from the table. I did not touch the divorce envelope. I kissed Lorraine on the cheek and thanked Julia under my breath. Rachel appeared at my side without speaking and squeezed my hand once. Gerald was already in a corner with 2 other investors, all 3 of them wearing the hard, detached expressions of men mentally converting trust into exposure. The terrace air had gone colder. Or maybe that was just what relief feels like once fear stops running the room. As I turned toward the elevator, Owen said my name. I stopped but did not turn around. There are moments when looking back gives too much away. I heard him take 1 step forward and then stop, Perhaps because he finally understood that nothing he could say in that room would return him to the story he had been telling when the evening began. So I kept walking. And behind me, in the rooftop glow he had paid for himself, the life he built on secrecy, entitlement, and the assumption of my silence began coming apart in full view. The phone started ringing before I reached the parking garage. Owen twice, my mother once, then my father. Then a number I did not recognize, which I assumed belonged to one of the investors or one of the attorneys who would soon begin reorganizing the damage into formal language. I let all of them ring. The garage smelled like concrete dust and hot brakes. I remember that because ordinary details become strangely vivid when your life has just changed shape in public. My heels sounded too loud on the painted floor. Rachel walked beside me without saying much. She had always understood that comfort is sometimes just competent presence. At my car, she touched my arm and asked, "Do you want me to come home with you?" I thought about it. The apartment, the silence, the part of the night that comes after witnesses go away and only your own body knows what it has cost to stay that calm. Then I shook my head. "No," I said, "but thank you." She looked at me for 1 second longer, as if checking whether I meant it, then nodded. "Call me if the walls start moving." That was her phrase for shock. I smiled for the first time all evening. "I will." I drove home with the windows cracked even though the night air was cold. Not because I needed air, because I needed the city to feel real. Streetlights, red lights, a man walking a dog outside a pharmacy, 2 women laughing outside a bar. The world continuing in its ordinary way while something private and enormous settled into a new form. When I got home, the house was dark. I stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights and looked at the outlines of things I had chosen. The blue bowl on the counter, the fig branch wallpaper I had argued for and paid extra to install. The brass lamp in the sitting room, Owen said, was too soft for the space and then later bragged about to guests as if he had discovered it himself. Then I took off my shoes, poured a glass of water, and listened to my voicemails. Owen's first message was angry. "What the hell did you do?" he said, already breathing too hard. "Do you understand what you've just cost me? Not us. Not my mother. Not the investors. Me." His second message came 14 minutes later and had already shifted into control. "We need to handle this privately now," he said, "before other people start making assumptions." That was almost enough to make me laugh. My mother's voicemail was exactly what I expected, shame disguised as concern. "Naomi, call me back immediately." This was completely inappropriate. Whatever he did, there were other ways to address it. There are always other ways when the people speaking never expected to be the ones absorbing the humiliation. My father's message was blunter. "You made a spectacle of yourself." Myself. Not the man who handed his wife divorce papers at a launch party. Not the son who drained his mother's retirement. Not the founder diverting money while preaching vision under string lights. Me. That message should not have hurt. But it did, briefly. Because some injuries arrive from repetition rather than surprise. My parents had spent my whole life respecting polish more than substance. Even then, even after everything, their first instinct was to defend the room rather than the truth. I deleted neither voicemail. Then I called Sheila. She answered on the second ring, as if she had been awake waiting. "How bad?" she asked. "Worse for him than for me," I said. There was a pause. "Good," she said. "Then listen carefully. Do not answer him directly tonight. Do not reply to family pressure. Save every voicemail. Photograph the envelope before you do anything else. Put it somewhere untouched after that. I'll call Gerald Sloane's attorney in the morning if he hasn't already reached out." I did exactly what she said. Then I took the envelope from my bag, laid it on the kitchen table under the pendant light, and photographed every page. The petition was as cold as I expected. Efficient, condescending in the disguised way expensive attorneys can be when they assume one spouse is too shocked to fight intelligently. Proposed asset division tilted around business protection. Temporary support framed as generous while depending heavily on my supposed future earning stability, which was ironic considering I had been partly financing the life they were now trying to separate me from cleanly. At the bottom of one page was a note in Owen's handwriting to himself. "Remember to keep tone calm. She won't want a scene." I sat down after reading that. Just sat there. Not crying, not raging, just letting the fact of him settle all the way through me. The next morning, the unraveling began exactly the way these things usually do. Quietly first, then all at once. At 8:12, Gerald Sloan's attorney contacted Sheila requesting a preservation notice and formal confirmation of any materials in my possession relevant to firm finances. At 8:36, one of the minority investors sent a message through counsel indicating he intended to suspend all pending capital release. By 9:10, Owen had texted me 6 times. "Please call me. This is getting out of control. You've made your point. We can still fix the narrative." The last one told me everything. Not fix the harm. Not tell the truth. Fix the narrative. At 10, Lorraine called. I answered immediately. She sounded tired, but lighter somehow. Not happy. There was no happiness in any of this, but relieved in the way people sound when they have finally stopped carrying a secret alone. "I'm sorry," she said first. That undid me more than anything else had. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and said, "You have nothing to apologize for." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have told someone sooner." Maybe she should have. Maybe I should have seen more sooner, too. But regret is easy after the pattern has been named. Survival rarely looks that clean while you're inside it. "We're here now," I said. She exhaled slowly. "Julia's still with me. She says I'm not allowed to minimize anything today." That actually made me smile. Over the next 2 weeks, the story moved through the circles Owen cared about most. Not as gossip exactly. People like his investors and clients rarely say scandalous things out loud if they can avoid it. They prefer terms like review, concern, fiduciary irregularity, pause. But polished language still destroys reputations when enough money is standing behind it. The launch event photographs never got published. The firm's website, which had been updated that afternoon with a new leadership page and staged photos from the office, went dark 3 days later. Marissa resigned by the end of the week. I learned that through Rachel, who still knew someone in Owen's operations team. Apparently, Marissa requested separation from both the firm and all public-facing transition matters. I do not know exactly what Owen told her before the rooftop, and I did not ask. She had made her own choices. But I also knew what it looked like to be chosen by a man who made women feel central only when they were useful to his version of himself. 2 investors filed civil claims within the month. A third did not sue but withdrew immediately and sent formal demand letters regarding disclosure failures and misuse of operating funds. Whether anything criminal would follow was no longer my decision or my concern. Martin told Sheila there was enough to make serious people ask serious questions. That was enough for me. The marriage part moved more slowly. Divorces always do when one person spent too long assuming the other would fold. Owen came to the house once while I was there, about 10 days after the rooftop. He let himself in with his key at 7, 40 inches the evening, and found me in the dining room, sorting documents into labeled folders. That image still feels right to me somehow. Him entering with all the force of a man expecting emotion, and me sitting under the chandelier he once insisted was too traditional, building chronology. He looked terrible. Not ruined. Men like Owen are rarely ruined as quickly as they deserve, but damaged in visible ways. Unshaven, collar open. Eyes carrying that particular bright strain people get when they have slept too little and explained too much to too many people. "You changed the alarm code," he said. "Yes. You had no right." I looked at him for a long second. Then I said, "That line has aged badly for you." He actually flinched. For a moment, I thought he might finally apologize. Truly apologize. Not for the exposure. For the design of it. For the cruelty of the envelope. For his mother. For the months of lying while I kept pouring my energy into a life he had already begun stripping for parts. Instead, he said, "You should have come to me first." That was when I knew, completely, that there was nothing left in him I needed to stay near. I put down the folder in my hands. "No," I said. "You wanted me on a stage." He stepped closer to the table. "I wanted this handled cleanly. You wanted me cornered." "That's not fair." I almost admired the reflex. Even then. Even after the rooftop. Fairness was still, in his mind, something owed upward toward him. I said, "You timed a divorce announcement to your own launch party because you thought public embarrassment would make me manageable. Don't talk to me about fairness." He opened his mouth and closed it again. Then he tried one last angle. Softer voice. Controlled regret. The version of him that once made me believe he understood depth, when really he just knew the shape of it. "Naomi," he said, "we can still protect some dignity here." I looked at him standing in the house I had partly funded while he siphoned money elsewhere and rehearsed my humiliation for investors. Then I answered the only way I could. "You had dignity," I said. "You used it as camouflage." He left 20 minutes later with a garment bag, 2 watches, a box of files he should have removed much earlier if he'd been half as strategic as he imagined, and none of the authority he came in with. After that, he stopped trying to persuade me directly. Attorneys took over. Good. That is where men like him belong when they have mistaken charm for structure for too long. The house sold 4 months later. I did not fight for it. That surprised people. My mother said I was being foolish. Owen's attorney said it indicated emotional inconsistency after earlier conflict. Sheila wrote back a response so precise it nearly qualified as literature. I simply did not want the house anymore. Too many things in it had been arranged around his appetite for impression. I bought an apartment on the east side of the city with tall windows, original oak floors, and a kitchen that caught the morning light. The first night there, I ate takeout on the floor because my dining table had not arrived yet and slept better than I had in nearly 2 years. Lorraine called me every Sunday after that. Sometimes we talked about practical things, her hydrangeas, the new bus route, a casserole Julia made badly but proudly. Sometimes we talked about grief without using the word grief. She never defended him again. That mattered to me more than dramatic condemnation would have. She chose reality, and some mothers never do. Julia and I got closer too. Not in a movie way, no grand declarations, just steadier contact, texts, coffee when she came through town, long walks when legal hearings lined up with her school breaks. One afternoon she admitted she had nearly gone to law school at 24 and backed away because her family needed less threatening versions of women than the one she might have become. 3 months later, she applied. That may be my favorite quiet ending in the whole story. Not the claims, not the public correction, that. A woman deciding she is no longer obligated to remain smaller for the comfort of men who confuse being centered with being right. As for my parents, I saw them much less after the rooftop, not because I made a dramatic announcement, because distance sometimes forms naturally once people realize you are no longer willing to help them maintain their preferred fictions. My mother wanted me to admit the setting had been too harsh. My father wanted me to concede that investors had overreacted. They both kept searching for a version of the story where my timing was the true offense. I refused to provide one. That refusal changed our relationship more than any argument could have. A year later, my life was quieter than I had ever allowed myself to imagine it could be. Not lonely. Clean. I cooked what I wanted, kept bourbon in plain sight, took a ceramics class on Wednesday evenings and made heavy, imperfect bowls I loved with unreasonable sincerity. I raised my rates, took fewer clients and better ones, traveled when I chose to, not when someone else's ambition required my labor in a nicer dress. One evening in October, I found the green silk dress I had worn on the rooftop, still hanging in the back of my closet. I almost donated it. Then I changed my mind and wore it to dinner alone. Good restaurant. Window seat. Oysters and a glass of cold white wine. No symbolism. Just use. I had spent too many years letting objects keep the emotional shape of men who did not deserve that kind of power. People sometimes ask whether I regret the rooftop. No. I regret the years before it. The years I explained away things my own body had already recognized. The years I treated my steadiness as an infinite resource other people could borrow against. The years I thought dignity meant enduring quietly while someone else designed my reduction. But the rooftop itself? No. He invited 180 people to watch me disappear. What they saw instead was much simpler. A man learning in public that the woman he depended on for silence had finally stopped protecting him from the truth. And the strangest part is this. That was not revenge. Not really. Revenge is loud, hungry. It wants the wound returned with interest. What I wanted was smaller and cleaner than that. I wanted the story to be accurate. I wanted his mother's voice heard in a room he thought belonged to him. I wanted the record to stop bending around his preferences. I wanted my own life back from the version of grace he kept demanding. That is what I got. Not triumph. Not justice in some dramatic, shining form. Just a quiet apartment with morning light, honest work, better sleep, new keys, fewer lies, a life that fit. And after everything, that felt like more than enough.